Hey folks, and welcome back to another Division 2 video. In this one, I'm going to tackle the subject of how damage is calculated in Tom Clancy's The Division 2, breaking down and simplifying what multiplicative and additive damage are and how they work. Let's jump into it. So there's often a lot of confusion when it comes to how damage is calculated in Tom Clancy's The Division 2. In this video, I'm going to go over how it works and how it's calculated, and by the end of this video you should have a much better understanding of how it all works. So this can be used as an easy reference guide. I'll chapter the video and add timestamps in the description so you can quickly find any specifics you're looking for in the future, and I'll also try and keep it as beginner friendly as possible. There are two main terms you'll hear a lot when people talk about damage or certain attributes in The Division 2. Multiplicative damage and additive damage. These two terms describe different ways that damage is calculated, and understanding the difference between these two different damage types can increase the power of your build and change how you create builds in the future. First, let's take a look at how damage is calculated in Tom Clancy's The Division 2 per shot. Now don't panic, this looks a little bit complicated, but don't worry, I'm going to break it down and make it much easier to understand. So what you're looking at here is base damage multiplied by total weapon damage and weapon damage added together, multiplied by critical hit damage and headshot damage added together, multiplied by an amplified damage source, then another potential amplified damage source, multiplied by damage to health, multiplied by damage to armor, multiplied by damage to targets out of cover, equals the damage per shot. If maths isn't your strong point, don't worry, this is nowhere near as complicated as it looks, and I'm going to be breaking it down into easier to understand parts. This is the total equation that works out how much damage you do every time you hit a target, but not every element in this sum comes into effect every time. I've simply included every possible and potential element as an example. The majority of the time, it's not going to be this complicated. For example, you won't have damage to health and damage to armor. I've just included them as two separate things to show that they're both multiplicative damage sources. And not every shot is going to be a headshot or a crit, but just like with damage to health and damage to armor, I've included them just to show the potential of this equation. So next, before I go through the steps of the equation, I want to go over each of these elements and what they mean so we're all on the same page and it gives you a better understanding of what we're looking at here. I imagine that you'll know what most of these are, but if you'd like a more in-depth look at the attribute definitions, take a look at my guide on the subject. I'll pop up here. The first element here is your base damage. This is the amount of damage your weapon does with zero other modifiers in effect. You can see your base damage by going to your weapon, selecting options and turning on base damage. This will show you a white number in brackets next to the orange weapon damage number. The orange number is the damage of your weapon with your weapon damage attributes included, but more on that later on. Next we have weapon damage. This is the core attribute you can find on some of your gear, as well as your weapon damage you can find on every gun. You can find these on your stats page under the offense category. The next one is total weapon damage. This is a damage increase you'll mainly see on talents, and is an additive damage type with normal weapon damage, but we'll talk more about additive damage a little bit later in the video. Then there's critical hit damage and headshot damage, which, like weapon damage and total weapon damage, are additive with each other. Next is amplified weapon damage. This is another weapon damage increase that you'll find on talents, but unlike total weapon damage, it's not additive to weapon damage, which means it works as its own multiplier and makes it multiplicative damage. Just like with additive damage, I'll go into this a little bit more shortly, but you can have multiple amplified weapon damage sources on a build, each working as their own multiplier. Then we have damage to health, damage to armor, and damage to targets out of cover. All three of these are multiplicative damage types, like amplified damage, and are all worked out as their own multipliers. Now that we have a better understanding of the elements in this equation, let's talk more about the two different damage types, multiplicative and additive. Multiplicative damage is a damage modifier that takes your current damage and multiplies it by a percentage to find a new value. For example, if we have a weapon damage of 10,000 and 10% damage to targets out of cover, which is multiplicative damage, first, we'd have to change the damage to targets out of cover from a percentage to a modifier. The simplest way to do this is to divide the percentage by 100 and add 1, changing 10% to 1.10. As an example of changing a percentage to a modifier, 10 divided by 100 equals 0.10. Plus 1 gives us 1.10. We can then multiply 10,000 by 1.10, which gives us 11,000. Pretty simple, right? As another example, if we have a base damage of 10,000 and 120% critical hit damage, and we get a crit, we change the 120% critical hit damage into a modifier by dividing the percentage by 100 and adding 1, giving us a modifier of 2.20 or 2.2. So 120 divided by 100 is 1.2. 1.2 plus 1 gives us 2.2, and 10,000 multiplied by 2.2 gives us a crit of 22,000. The other kind of damage you'll hear about is additive damage. Additive damage is damage types that have their percentages added together before they become a damage modifier. In the Division 2, there are two areas when you're working out damage where you'll find additive damage. Weapon damage, like you get on gear and weapons, along with total weapon damage, and critical hit damage along with headshot damage. So as an example of how this works, if we have 15% weapon damage on two of your core attributes giving us 30% weapon damage, and you have vigilance on your backpack which increases total weapon damage by 25%. Before we can convert these into a modifier, we add the two percentages together giving us 55%. Then, like earlier, we divide the percentage by 100 and add 1, giving us 1.55. So if we break this down, 30 plus 25 gives us 55. 55 divided by 100 equals 0.55. 0.55 plus 1 gives us 1.55. Then 10,000 multiplied by 1.55 gives us 15,500. The same method goes for critical hit damage and headshot damage. If you critically hit the body, you only have to multiply by the critical hit damage value. But if you critically hit the head, then you'll have to add the critical hit percentage and the headshot damage percentage together before converting them into a modifier. So now we've covered the elements of the equation I showed you earlier and the differences between multiplicative and additive damage types, let's go back to the equation and go through it in steps. First, drop any elements that don't apply to your current build or situation. If you're working out a body shot, you don't need headshot damage. If you want to find a non-crit value, you don't need to take critical hit damage into account. Same goes for damage to health, armor, or targets out of cover. Then work out any additive damage types you have in your build, weapon damage and total weapon damage, or crit and headshot, and once you've done that, convert your percentages to modifiers, and work down the equation starting with your base damage. I know this all might be a lot to take in, but I wouldn't worry if you don't completely understand how this works. All you need to do is plug your own numbers into the equation and follow the steps. I hope this gives you a better idea of how damage is calculated in the Division 2. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, give it a thumbs up, and subscribe for more Division 2 content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.